So now that we have discussed the different types of receptor, this would be a good time to understand what are the different kinds of ligands or different kinds of drugs based upon their interactions on the receptors. Again, in this context, there are two very important properties of any ligand that we need to understand. First of them is affinity, which is basically the ability of any ligand to bind with the receptor. The second one is intrinsic activity, which is the ability of the ligand to produce a conformational change in the receptor, which leads to generation of a signal and the ultimate effect of the drug-ligand interaction. Again, to have intrinsic activity, a ligand must have affinity, because if a ligand cannot bind with the receptor, it cannot produce any change in the receptor. So, going by that, the first kind of ligand that is very important for us to understand would be the agonists. Now, what is an agonist? An agonist is basically a ligand that has both affinity and full intrinsic activity on a particular receptor. That means the agonist can bind with the receptor, and agonist leads to the conformational change that leads to maximum generation of signal or generation of a full strength signal, which leads to maximal physiological effect. For example, acetylcholine is the agonist on the muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Similarly, adrenaline is the agonist on the beta-2 adrenergic receptor, and likewise morphine is the agonist on the mu type of opioid receptors. The second kind of ligand would be the antagonists, and from the name we can make a guess that the antagonists, they antagonize the effect of agonists. So antagonists are the ligands that have affinity, but they do not have any intrinsic activity. That means antagonists can bind with the receptors, but they themselves do not have any action. They cannot induce any conformational change or generate any signal on binding with the receptor. So they just block the receptor and prevent the binding of the agonists. So the actions of agonists are not produced. Example of an antagonist, again in respect of the cholinergic system, would be atropine, which is the antagonist of acetylcholine on the muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Similarly, propranolol would be the antagonist to adrenaline on the beta-adrenergic receptor, and naloxone would be the antagonist to morphine on the mu type of opioid receptors. Now, somewhere between the agonists and antagonists, we have partial agonists. Again, from the name, we can understand that the partial agonists will have some partial action, right? So, partial agonists, they have affinity, but they have only partial or submaximal intrinsic activity. That means after binding with the receptor, the partial agonists will produce some conformational change and lead to generation of that effect, but the effect will not be similar in magnitude to the effect that is produced by the agonist. The effect produced by the partial agonist will always be less than what is produced by a full agonist. So, again, another perspective of looking at this phenomena is that while there is no agonist present, partial agonist will do the role of the agonist to some extent. It will produce some action. But if the agonist is present there, the partial agonist is itself blocking the receptor and it's not letting the agonist to act on the receptor. So the partial agonist is preventing the full action of the receptor. So in that context, or from that perspective, partial agonist is also behaving like a partial antagonist when the agonist is there. So example of a partial agonist in the opioid receptor would be buprenorphine. Buprenorphine binds with the mu type of opioid receptor and it prevents the full action of morphine. However, if there is no morphine present in the system, buprenorphine itself will have some action on the opioid receptor. It will produce some of the opioid effects. And lastly, we have the very weird and very interesting kind of ligand, that is the inverse agonist. Now the inverse agonist, again from the name we can get an idea, it does something that's totally opposite or inverse of a full agonist. So inverse agonists, they have affinity at the same receptor, but their intrinsic activity would be in the opposite direction of the full agonist. So if the full agonist produces some kind of a physiological effect, inverse agonist will produce the opposite effect. For example, on the benzodiazepine receptor, benzodiazepine drugs like diazepam, they act and produce effects like sedation or drowsiness. Now, beta-carbolin is an inverse agonist on the same benzodiazepine receptor. And when beta-carbolin acts, it produces opposite action of benzodiazepine, that is, it produces agitation and restlessness. Now, a related concept in this regard are those of the mixed agonist-antagonists. Mixed agonist-antagonists, they have agonist action on a subtype of a particular receptor, but again, they can also have antagonist action on a different subtype of the same receptor. For example, the opioid receptors, they have three subtypes like mu, kappa, and delta. Now, pentagocin is a mixed agonist-antagonist which have some agonistic action on the kappa opioid receptor, but it has antagonistic action on the mu subtype of the same opioid receptor.